The subcommittee on space will come to order. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Necessary Updates to the Commercial Space Launch Act. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and required truth and testimony disclosures for today's witnesses. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the NASA Day of Remembrance, which was observed last Friday as a tribute to the crews of Apollo 1 and the space shuttles Columbia and Challenger. These men and women lost their lives in the pursuit of exploration and discovery, and they will never be forgotten. In his 1984 State of the Union speech, President Reagan reminded us that our progress in space is a tribute to American teamwork and excellence. He challenged our best and brightest to develop launch companies ready to lift payloads to orbit regularly with minimal government interference. Shortly after his speech, Congress responded with passage of the Commercial Space Launch Act. As we once more consider changes to this groundbreaking legislation, President Reagan's words ring just as true for us today as they did 3 decades ago. We must continue providing a framework for supporting the development of commercial space launch. As the commercial space industry evolves, so too should our laws and federal regulations. While there are many issues we will address in the next CSLA, it is my desire that we give special focus to issues surrounding launch indemnification and the regulatory learning period. The third-party liability risk-sharing regime, which we know today as indemnification, provided a much-needed safety net for new companies that were developing to fill the nation's launch needs after commercial satellite launches with shuttle ended. Since it was first created in 1988, the regime has been extended 6 times, most recently a few weeks ago on the omnibus spending bill. I look forward to hearing what our witnesses have to say about this provision and any changes to it that might be helpful. In 2004, as part of the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act, Congress placed a moratorium on most regulations related to spaceflight participants and vehicle design to ensure ample flexibility for a developing commercial human space launch industry. The need for this provision at the time was clear. How can the FAA regulate an industry that does not exist and has not flown a single paying customer? Today, the situation hasn't changed much. The FAA still has no data to use for regulations, and the commercial human space launch industry is still working hard to get off the ground. The Commercial Crew Development Program at NASA has done a lot to move the industry along by providing an anchor tenant for orbital commercial human spaceflight, funding for early-stage development and funding to mature spacecraft designs. While the suborbital market seems to be maturing rapidly, it is still not clear that there is a business case for non-government orbital human space tourism in the near future. What is clear is that if the FAA begins trampling on these companies with regulations based on speculation instead of data, we may never see the promise of commercial human spaceflight realized. The learning period will expire in 2015, and I look forward to what our witnesses have to say about this provision and its relative importance to the industry. There are many other issues that may need to be addressed in a potential commercial space bill, such as streamlining the permitting process, offering more flexibility for experimental aircraft, better defining the various types of spacecraft, and strengthening the informed consent provisions. We must also ensure that export controls and international trafficking and arms regulations are rational and productive. We need to provide stable, certain, and competitive regulatory environments at the Federal Aviation Administration, the Federal Communications Commission, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that facilitate domestic investment. I have to mention that as I prepared for this hearing, I reviewed an article in the Journal of Space Law, which is published by the University of Mississippi School of Law. Ole Miss is a world premier space law program, and I'm happy to know that Mississippi is at the forefront of these challenging issues. I look forward to working with both sides of the aisle in the next few months to come up with bipartisan solutions to these issues. There's a lot of promise in the future of commercial spaceflight, and if we work together, I know we can put in place policies that will help grow our economy in this great industry. With that, I yield to the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I hope you all bear with my voice. I promised the chairman of the full committee that I'd go easy on him today because I don't have a voice, and I'll honor that promise. I appreciate all our witnesses here today, and I'm looking back to when the Commercial Space Launch Act was passed in 1984, and I think and then amendments, of course, in 1988 and 2004, and I think it's fair to say that the commercial space industry indeed has come a long way. Not only has it come a long way, but it's growing and changing every day as companies and entrepreneurs continue to generate new ideas and technical concepts for potential commercial space transportation systems. Mr. Chairman, I think this type of ingenuity and innovative spirit that defines our nation and our economic potential is great, and I want to see it succeed. And as I said before, I'm one of those adventurers who wants to be a passenger, but of course I want it to be safe. And of course my enthusiasm is tempered by the recognition that there are a number of questions that remain outstanding in this growing industry that need to be answered and issues that need to be resolved. The recently passed extension of the third-party liability and indemnification regime for 3 years, I think, means that we have the time for a thorough and thoughtful examination of these questions, and I look forward to our subcommittee conducting future hearings to address them. For example, should we be providing indemnification permanently, or should we be laying the groundwork for a shift toward an insurance-based regime? How might such a transition occur, and on what timeline? What would such a transition mean for the insurance industry, and what other industry models can we examine for good practices? There are also questions about how liability should be treated for passengers or spaceflight participants, as they're called. And that brings me to the question of whether the policy and regulations for commercial space flights with humans should differ from that for commercial launches carrying satellites, cargo, or other payloads, which have comprised the commercial space industry to date. In short, the real question is whether a one-size-fits-all approach to commercial space transportation and policy and regulation are appropriate for this industry, or should we consider different frameworks for commercial human and commercial uncrewed space transportation systems. Already we're seeing the existing statute being tested every day by the evolving nature of the industry. So I hope that we're going to be able to answer some of these questions. I'm going to enter my full statement into the record so that I can relieve your ears of my voice. But I will say that I think this sampling of the range of questions for our witnesses today tells us that we have so much more to learn, and I really do hope that this committee will do what is intended, and that is really thoroughly and thoughtfully examine all of these questions, because I think it's important both for the maturing and growing industry, but it's also important for any potential passengers and crews. And I know that we hadn't had that time before, but certainly with this 3-year extension in place, we have the time for that kind of thoughtful consideration right now. And we also have the time to examine other industries that have evolved, and we have examples of them that may show us some window into the way that we need to deal with the potential liabilities in this industry. And with that, I yield.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee for a statement.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me confess at the outset and say to the ranking member, Donna Edwards, that there are some days I wish she had laryngitis, but today is actually not one of them. Furthermore, now that she is engaged to a Texan, I assume she'll be voting with me more often.
Mr. Chairman, that was not really public.
Oh. Oh. Well, I was looking at your engagement ring. I thought that was a giveaway. Sorry.
In that case, thank you.
We'll scratch that from the record just for the... Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for having this hearing. Also, I want to say we have excellent witnesses today. Americans' record of ingenuity is filled with examples of entrepreneurs who push the boundaries of the possible. The commercial space industry relies on this same creative spirit. 3 decades ago, Congress and the President Reagan worked together to pass the Commercial Space Launch Act. This legislation paved the way for American entrepreneurs to reach for the stars. America has always been a nation of innovators and explorers. We continue to remain on the forefront of new discoveries and technologies. Members of Congress were looking toward the future when they passed the Commercial Space Launch Act. They had the foresight to understand that space may not be the final frontier, but it is certainly the next frontier. Were it not for this legislation, perhaps we would not have some of the modern conveniences that we take for granted today. The Space Subcommittee recently held a hearing with representatives of the commercial space industry. The message from those witnesses was clear. They need the government to be consistent in its policy, and regulations need to allow them flexibility to develop their businesses and hire more American workers. In 1984, there were 18 federal agencies involved in every launch. The system was inefficient and suffocated the industry. Congress passed the Commercial Space Launch Act to get government out of the way and reduce bureaucracy so American businesses could be innovative and develop. Perhaps we can continue to learn from that strategy. Today, the subcommittee will examine various aspects of the commercial space launch industry and how it is affected by that act. There are several provisions of the law that need to be updated, and the industry continues to evolve. So must the laws that govern it. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you and the ranking member and our friends on the other side of the aisle to draft a commercial space bill that will encourage the growth of the commercial space industry. Now, before I yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, I'd like to single out and recognize Stu Witt in the front row there, who is the chairman of the Commercial Space Flight Federation and is here from California. Stu, welcome to the hearing. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield to the Vice Chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you very much, and let me just note, as the author of the Commercial Space Launch Act of 2004, I'd like to briefly touch on just three aspects of today's hearing. First, the regulatory learning period of commercial space regulations. Overcoming the challenges of creating and perfecting new space technologies has taken longer than we predicted 10 years ago when we passed this act, and we expected flights to begin much earlier than they actually have begun. What we should have done is structure this so the 8-year timeline started with the first commercial flight carrying a space flight participant. The most important point, however, is that we move forward and that as we are moving forward, that regulating in the absence of actual flight data is the worst choice that we can make. So item number 2 is the limits on testing of space vehicles once launch licenses have been issued. Virgin Galactic is continuing their powered test flights on Spaceship Two, and the FAA is close to a decision on their license application. Their ability to complete their test programming, however, may be at risk once they've received the license. So, I mean, the last thing I can assure everyone here that we never intended a company's ability to test their vehicle or gather additional safety information to be limited simply because a license has been approved. And finally, the current law indemnifies launch providers from claims above the insurance requirements, but it also indemnifies government against the most probable claims in the case of an incident. This shared indemnification is important to both the government and the industry, and we should make sure that we look at it as such. And so I look forward to our hearing of our witnesses. I have to leave at 3 o'clock, but I'm really looking forward to your testimony, and I may not be able to stay for the question period, but thank you very much for yielding time and letting me put this on the record.
Thank you. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. George Nield, Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation at the Federal Aviation Administration. Dr. Nield came to the FAA from the Orbital Sciences Corporation, where he served as Senior Scientist for the Advanced Programs Group. He was the manager of the Flight Integration Office for the Space Shuttle program at Johnson Space Center, a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy. He holds an MS and PhD in Aeronautics and Astronautics from Stanford University and an MBA from George Washington University. Our second witness is Dr. Alicia Cackley, Director of the Financial Markets and Community Investment Team at the Government Accountability Office. She oversees policy research and program evaluation on a broad range of insurance, consumer protection, housing, and finance issues. Ms. Cackley received her PhD in economics from the University of Michigan and has been with the GAO since 1990. Our third witness is Dr. Henry Hertzfeld, Research Professor of Space Policy and International Affairs at the Elliot School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He is also an Adjunct Professor of Law at GW. Dr. Hertzfeld has served as a senior economist and policy analyst at both NASA and the National Science Foundation and is a consultant to both U.S. and international agencies and organizations. Dr. Hertzfeld is a member of the Bar in Pennsylvania and the District of Columbia. He received his Ph.D. from Temple University. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which members of the committee have 5 minutes each to ask questions. Your written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. I now recognize our first witness, Dr. Nield, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Palazzo, Ranking Member Edwards, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. This is an exciting time for commercial space transportation, and I appreciate having the opportunity to provide you with an update. Since I last testified before the subcommittee in 2012, the level of commercial space transportation activity in the United States has increased significantly. For example, in fiscal year 2012, there were only 3 FAA licensed or permitted launches. In FY 2013, there were 18, a 6-fold increase. Prospects for continued growth are solid. Both SpaceX and Orbital Sciences Corporation are now conducting launches under FAA licenses in order to deliver supplies to our astronauts on board the International Space Station. Sierra Nevada Corporation, Boeing, and SpaceX are all developing systems to carry NASA astronauts to and from the space station as part of NASA's Commercial Crew Program. The development of suborbital vehicles is also continuing, with a number of flight tests expected during the coming year. Virgin Galactic and X-Core Aerospace have signed up nearly 1,000 potential participants. Yet space tourism is just the tip of the iceberg. Potential suborbital missions include conducting scientific research, demonstrating new technologies, media and public relations, educational outreach, and satellite deployment. New ideas and plans are coming our way with increasing frequency. Right now, we have about 25 ongoing pre-application consultations. This number includes proposals for new vehicles, new spaceports, safety approvals, and requests for payload reviews. All of these indicators are signs of industry growth. The FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation has a twofold mission: to ensure protection of the public, property, and the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States during commercial launch and reentry activities, and to encourage, facilitate, and promote commercial space transportation. To carry out our safety responsibilities, we develop and issue regulations, grant licenses, permits, and safety approvals, and conduct safety inspections during every licensed or permitted launch. With the advent of on-orbit commercial space transportation, the FAA has begun a dialogue with our stakeholders to explore the need for adjustments to the FAA's statutory authority. As the number of commercial space transportation vehicles increases, it is appropriate to consider closing the current regulatory and safety gap between launch and reentry. The FAA believes it is time to explore the orbital safety of commercial space transportation under the Commercial Space Launch Act licensing regime. As the popular film Gravity was able to illustrate so dramatically, collisions in space can have devastating effects. The FAA's experience with collision avoidance includes conducting analyses and implementing orbital debris mitigation practices for U.S. licensed launches. The National Space Transportation Policy, which was issued in November of 2013, calls on the FAA to execute exclusive authority in this area. Should the FAA's authority be increased, we would work to ensure that appropriate levels of orbital safety are maintained, in addition to our responsibility for launches and reentries. The goal would be for the FAA to address orbital transportation safety, including for orbital debris mitigation, for spacecraft whose primary function was transportation. Finally, I'd like to assure the subcommittee that our partnership with NASA with respect to its commercial activities is proceeding very smoothly. We strongly support the administration's requested changes to the Commercial Space Launch Act that would add a third category of occupants called government astronauts. The changes would complement our existing definitions of crew and spaceflight participants and would increase transparency and ease the administration of our regulations in the context of NASA astronauts serving as crew. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my prepared remarks. I would be pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Nield. I now recognize our next witness, Dr. Cackley, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Palazzo, Ranking Member Edwards, and members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to be here today to talk about the Federal Aviation Administration's Commercial Space Launch Indemnification Program. As you are aware, a catastrophic commercial launch accident could have a significant impact on the uninvolved public or third parties in the form of personal injuries or property damage. In anticipation of such an event, a launch company must purchase a fixed amount of insurance for each launch per calculation by the FAA. According to the 1988 amendments of the Commercial Space Launch Act, or CSLA, the federal government is then potentially liable for claims above that amount, up to an additional $3 billion, as adjusted for inflation and subject to congressional appropriations. My statement today is based on work that we completed in July of 2012 at the request of this committee and the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, with some updates as of January 2014 of FAA launch data and insurance industry capacity, as well as FAA's progress on implementing our recommendation. In July 2012, we compared the U.S. government's indemnification policy with those of other countries and found that the United States provides less indemnification for third-party losses than key competitors such as China, France, and Russia, because these countries put no upper limit on the amount of their coverage, while in the U.S. coverage stops at about $3 billion per launch. However, for a given launch, the point at which the U.S. government starts to cover losses, the maximum probable loss, may be lower than in other countries. In all these countries, including the U.S., these commitments to pay have never been tested because there has never been a third-party claim that exceeded the launch company's insurance and thus reached the level of government indemnification. As a result, the potential cost to the federal government of indemnification for third-party losses is unclear. Estimating probable losses from a rare catastrophic event is difficult, but how accurate that calculation is depends on the soundness of the methodology that generates it. In July 2012, insurance industry officials and risk modeling experts told us that FAA's method of calculating maximum probable loss was outdated, had not been reviewed by outside experts, and may not be sound. An inaccurate calculation that understates the amount of insurance a launch provider must obtain would increase the likelihood of cost to the federal government and lower insurers' costs, whereas a calculation that overstates the amount of insurance would decrease the likelihood of federal costs and raise insurers' costs. In addition, the possible growth in commercial launches, including manned launches, could increase the number of launches eligible for CSLA coverage and thus potential costs for the federal government. In July 2012, FAA officials said that their method for calculating maximum probable loss was reasonable and conservative, but they agreed that a review could be beneficial and that involvement of outside experts might be helpful for improving their methodology. In January 2014, FAA told us they have taken some initial steps toward revising and updating their maximum probable loss methodology, but that budget constraints have prevented further progress in the short term. We continue to believe that our July 2012 recommendation that FAA periodically review and update as appropriate its methodology for calculating launch providers' insurance requirements has merit and should be fully implemented. With respect to the ability and willingness of the insurance market to provide additional third-party liability coverage, industry representatives we contacted in July 2012 told us the market was generally willing and able to provide up to $500 million per launch, and one insurer recently confirmed this is still the case. Because the amount of insurance FAA requires launch providers to obtain averages about $82 million per launch as of 2014, and coverage available through CSLA is about $3 billion above a given launch's maximum probable loss, insurers could provide some of the coverage currently available through CSLA. namely the difference between the maximum probable loss and the $500 million the industry indicated was the most they might provide. However, industry representatives cautioned that the amount and price of insurance that they might provide could change quickly if a large loss were to occur. Oh, this didn't print. If those costs are passed on to customers, U.S. launch companies could be more expensive and therefore less competitive than their foreign counterparts. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me start this last part over. Finally, while ending indemnification could potentially decrease U.S. competitiveness, this depends on many factors, and the actual effects are currently unknown. Launch companies and customers GAO contacted in July 2012 believed that ending federal indemnification could lead to higher launch costs for U.S. launch companies. If those costs are passed on to customers, U.S. launch companies could be more expensive and therefore less competitive than their foreign counterparts. However, it is unclear exactly how much the cost of third-party liability insurance, which brokers told us is about 1% of the total insurance coverage purchased by launch companies, might increase in the absence of federal coverage. And while launch customers said that price and vehicle reliability were key factors in their choice of a launch company, it is also not clear whether the increase in insurance costs alone would be sufficient reason for a launch customer to choose a foreign launch company over a U.S. company. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my prepared statement. I would be happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Cackley. I now recognize our final witness, Dr. Hertzfeld, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the topic of updating the Commercial Space Launch Act.
Microphone, please.
Are we okay now?
Oh.
I'm sorry. I'll start again. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the topic of updating the Commercial Space Launch Act. This act has proven to be a very powerful and productive force in stimulating commercial space transportation in the United States. The Department of Transportation, through the Federal Aviation Administration, has carried out its obligations well, and the United States is recognized as a responsible nation in administering commercial space launch activities. The FAA has also been successful in promoting commercial space endeavors. The fact that regulations have remained predictable, stable, consistent, and have been administered with fairness and transparency is alone enough to provide confidence in the domestic and international commercial communities. But there are some considerations that the Congress should address as commercial space activities evolve. The first is jurisdictional. The DOT is an agency with expertise in administering rules concerning all types of transportation, but it has no special expertise in the fields of resource extraction, energy generation, or moon landings, all of which are being seriously proposed for outer space commercial projects. In fact, Congress has not granted to any agency specific regulatory powers over most activities in outer space. And examples of that include launching a payload from a platform in space, oversight of a commercial payload landing on an asteroid or other celestial body, extracting, moving, or returning Earth resources from space. It's important to remember that by treaty agreements, the United States government, as a launching state, is ultimately liable for damages from these activities should something go wrong. Rather than expand the scope of the CSLA, I would recommend that Congress consider allocating future jurisdiction over non-transportation issues to agencies with the required expertise in those areas. That's been the approach Congress has chosen in the past, witnessed by the Department of Commerce licensing of remote sensing payloads and the earlier FCC licensing of telecommunications satellites. At the same time, Congress should clearly define the jurisdictional limits of the CSLA in order to avoid overlaps. Topic of indemnification. If there were a catastrophic accident in space involving a U.S. government or corporate asset, politics and international relations, rather than any congressional limit, would likely determine who would pay and how much. The good news, of course, is that the probability of such a catastrophic accident in space is relatively small. The bad news is that some orbits are becoming crowded, and there's a growing probability that an accident with large economic consequences could happen. This, coupled with emerging space capabilities such as satellite servicing, active debris removal, or moving asteroids, will raise new insurance and indemnification issues. Examples, again, are although launch insurance is required, satellite insurance is not. The United States could undertake an effort to negotiate international agreements for limits to liability from damages in space. There's no international enforceable and binding dispute resolution system for commercial accidents in outer space. Binding arbitration might be one to consider. The United States government should adopt incentives for private industry to develop its own insurance pool, possibly eliminating the need for government indemnification. Regarding the experimental period for suborbital human flight, there's no clear answer to when the experimental period should end, but it certainly will have to be extended beyond 2015. There are a number of companies developing human suborbital systems. Each company has a different technological approach, making any end to an experimental period unique to each. Congress is faced with a dilemma. If it ends the experimental period when the first company is deemed to be successful, it penalizes late starters. But if it continues it indefinitely, then final regulations for safety in suborbital vehicles will be greatly delayed, possibly risking lives and damage. In regard to other nations, all launching states or parties to the Outer Space Treaty have agreed to assume liability and indemnify launches. But there is no guarantee that if a problem occurs in space, all will handle it the same way or in a way that will be satisfactory to other nations. With the exception of a major unilateral shift in the indemnification regime, such as terminating the U.S. government's guarantee, it is unlikely that the current CSLA or any changes to it will significantly alter the competitiveness of U.S. launch companies. In summary, the CLSA has proven to be effective and responsive to U.S. industry's needs. However, because of the diverse spread of expertise and responsibility among different federal agencies, the Congress should address the interagency coordination of all United States space activities so that future commercial space licenses will be handled effectively, efficiently, and quickly with the maximum transparency that's possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hertzfeld. I thank the witnesses for being available for questioning today. Reminding members that committee rules limits questioning to 5 minutes. The chair will at this point open the round of questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. When Congress enacted the law to promote commercial human spaceflight in 2004, it included an 8-year learning period to allow industry to innovate without excessive regulation, while allowing the FAA to write rules based on actual problems during licensed flights. Unfortunately, it's taken a long time for the industry to emerge, so Congress extended this for the full duration of the FAA Reauthorization Act in 2012, basically until September 30th, 2015. It is my understanding that FAA's Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, COMSTAC, has recommended that the learning period be restored to a full 8 years from the first licensed flight of a spaceflight participant. Do you agree with the FAA Advisory Committee's recommendation? I'd like to start with Dr. Nield.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what the FAA has been doing since Congress extended the learning period to give some context to the question itself. When we were asked to engage with industry about this subject, we went out and consulted with industry, specifically with COMSTAC, with NASA, with the Civil Aerospace Medical Institute, CAMI, is part of the FAA, and with academia, specifically the Center of Excellence for Commercial Space Transportation, and asked for their help and advice. We then held a series of 8 public teleconferences to discuss what the FAA's oversight should look like, what levels of safety are appropriate, abort systems, fault tolerance, design margins, medical best practices, communications, and many other topics. And after reviewing the data and the lessons learned from the last 50 years of human spaceflight, we developed a draft document entitled The Established Practices of Human Spaceflight Occupant Safety. And we posted that on our website and asked for comments from industry and from NASA. We're currently in the process of reviewing those comments, and we hope to finalize the document this year. The ultimate goal is to gain the consensus of government, industry, and academia. And really, the document has 2 purposes. First of all, to serve as a framework and a benchmark for industry to use in developing industry consensus standards. And secondly, to serve as a baseline and a starting point should there be a need for government to issue regulations at some point in the future once the moratorium has expired. So that sets the stage for where we are. I'd be happy to expand on that later if you have time.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nield. Dr. Hertzfeld, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I don't think I can. I think that an arbitrary extension at this point, such as the 8 years that you had mentioned in your question, might not be wise, but I think there is, at some point, a judgment call that will have to be made to end that period, and it should be based, I think, on the technical basis of the experience that we've had, particularly from the early flights, and the expectations from any of the companies that might be in the wings to begin to start.
The FAA interprets the CSLA to require a company with a licensed vehicle design to forfeit its ability to continue testing and improving that design once it has been put into service. Can you explain why the FAA believes it does not have the flexibility to allow these vehicles to continue testing, Dr. Nield?
Yes, our interpretation of the current law is that an experimental permit can only be used for specified purposes, basically for training or for demonstrating compliance, whereas a license can be used for compensation or hire, basically for commercial use. And although it's been mentioned already today that the intent was not to prevent or make difficult the opportunity to go back and forth, the way we read the current law, once a license is issued for a vehicle of the same design that currently has a permit, the permit would no longer be valid. Now, there is a way forward, which is you can still continue to do testing under a launch license, but under current law, we can't go back and forth.
In 2012, GAO recommended that FAA should review the MPL calculation to ensure it is sound. How far along is FAA in the process, and what have you found so far? Again, Dr. Nield.
We completely agree with the GAO recommendations. We believe we have a reasonable process, which has been conservative, but we solicit and welcome outside scrutiny and recommendations on how to improve the process. We have come up in-house with what we think is a more objective and more accurate way of calculating the maximum probable loss. What we'd like to do is spend the next 12 months basically to do an IV&V, an independent verification and validation of that software to make sure that it can be used for these very important decisions, basically how much insurance each company has to go get. And again, we think it would be also valuable to have outside experts critique that, although there may be some funding requirements that are associated with that. So we'd be happy to come back to the committee later on in the year and give you a better progress report, but that's where we are right now.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Bonamici for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for bringing your expertise to the subcommittee. Dr. Hertzfeld, I want to ask about accident investigation involving commercial space operations. What would we need to know if we needed to determine what entity, whether it be an existing or new entity, should have the authority to investigate commercial spaceflight accidents, including those involving human spaceflight participants? How should investigations be handled? What type of expertise would be needed? And are there other high-risk industries that can serve as models?
I really have not given that any thought in preparation for the testimony today. But when I testified in 2011, I believe I did address a couple of issues related to that. And I think the National Transportation Safety Board generally has authority to investigate accidents related to transportation. Unless the law has been changed, space was left out of the actual list of those modes to which they would investigate. But I believe there's an MOU between the Commercial Space Office and the National Transportation Safety Board for accidents above a certain limit amount or those involving human beings would be under their jurisdiction. And if we go back to the shuttle Columbia accident, I believe they were also involved because they've had a lot of expertise in this area. NASA, of course, in the human space flight has had experience as well in accident investigation. But when something like this happens, the expertise within the government is found among the various agencies, and I don't think any agency would decline to participate.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Dr. Nield, what data should industry be required to collect in order to facilitate a potential accident investigation should an accident occur?
We currently require a lot of information as part of a launch license process in terms of the vehicle and toxic propellants and the trajectories, what the hazards are and so forth. So we already have that in place. And as Dr. Hertzfeld mentioned, we currently have MOUs, memorandums of understanding, between the FAA, the National Transportation Safety Board, and the Department of the Air Force to conduct investigations should there be an accident that occurs in the future.
Can you think of any data that isn't being collected that might facilitate an accident investigation, or it's your position that everything that should be collected is already being collected?
I think we have a good set of requirements in terms of what information we'd need up front. To build on your question, though, I think what could really help the industry going forward is a greater willingness to share information about close calls and incidents and accidents that do occur among the various companies. And, of course, that could be a difficult issue when you talk about proprietary data and competition, but that could really help the safety.
Terrific. Thank you. And for all the members of the panel, the Commercial Space Launch Act requires that space operators, before receiving compensation or agreeing to fly a space flight participant, inform each participant in writing about the risks of the launch and reentry, and it's my understanding that that's according to the vehicle type. Now, some say that informed consent is not a waiver of liability for any enhanced exposure to injury caused by the operator's carelessness, if any, and they advocate having each spaceflight participant exchange a liability waiver with the commercial launch provider. So basically, parties would agree not to file claims against the other party if there's an accident. Now, others are concerned about the rights of the passengers and their families, and that they should be protected in the event of an accident. So what are your views on whether there should be cross waivers between spaceflight participants and commercial launch providers? Is informed consent still appropriate as we move to regularly scheduled and paid suborbital flights? And I think I'll start with Dr. Hertzfeld. I don't know if the other of you are lawyers. It's a bit of a legal question.
The way the system works today is the wording of the informed consent statement is left to the companies, I believe. Many states that have spaceports or are considering spaceports have passed legislation with wording on the informed consent, and each one is slightly different. And I think that is something of concern. Looking ahead, states, it's quite fine for states to compete against each other for economic reasons. But some of these some of these laws are aimed at protecting the operator from a suit by one of the passengers if something went wrong, and with the exception, I believe, of willful actions or gross negligence. They read differently, and this may be something that the federal government should consider for preemption, and it might be because the FAA has more data, more information on all of the companies and all of the risks, wording that perhaps should be drafted by the FAA and be uniform throughout the country.
Thank you very much, and I see my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Mr. Rohrbacher for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to have to be out of here in 5 minutes, so we'll get right to it. Dr. Nield, now you're going to have to correct me if I'm wrong in my assessment of what the law says, but right now, when some company, like I guess Virgin Galactic, gets a space launch license, at that point, their ability to continue testing is highly restricted. Is that correct?
Just to be precise, currently Scaled Composites has the permit for Spaceship Two. Virgin will be the eventual customer, and they have applied for a launch license.
Right.
But once that license is issued, the use of a permit is invalidated.
So they can't go. So what we're saying is that it makes sense to restrict the testing of something that has already been approved. But we don't believe in perfecting it anymore, or make it even a little more safer. Does that make any sense to you, that we're actually stopping a company that might want to test to see if there's more perfections they can do of their technology?
That doesn't make any sense at all, and I would certainly not recommend that. Now,
okay, so
additional testing could take place under a license, but if there's bureaucracy involved here, then we ought to take a look at improving that.
Mr. Chairman, I guess that means that something we could do in law to make sure that because someone has received a license, that they are not cut off then from improving what they have, the technology that they have. But that's necessary right now for us to change the law for that to happen. And let me ask, right now you've got 18 federal agencies that in some way have something to do with the launch industry, and it was decided, and we've tried to focus most of this regulation on the Department of Transportation and the FAA Commercial Space Office. Doctor, you seem to be suggesting that we need to have more offices and more different bureaucrats involved, complicating the process more rather than facilitating something that we need to develop in our country. You know what they say is bureaucracy is the most efficient system ever devised to turn creative energies into solid waste. And you seem to be advocating more government bureaucrats than less.
Not exactly. I used the word agencies in my testimony. That is correct. But I was focusing more on expertise, wherever that might come from, and however it might be best coordinated throughout the federal government. And even with 18 agencies involved, there is an intergovernmental review of all these licenses that goes to a number of agencies, and that process is apparently not working quite as well as it might, and has slowed down some licenses. So that there is also, as I mentioned, a void in the law about on-orbit and in outer space activities.
Right.
So that we're going to have to close that at some point. And when we do, many of these other expertise, areas of other expertise will be necessary. And I think we have to.
I would hope that when we have areas of expertise that we don't set up a system in which someone who wants to participate in this incredible new avenue for human entrepreneurism, that we have them going to 20 different offices in order to talk to 20 different government officials in order to get curry favor with each one of them. And if one of them doesn't put the stamp on the paper, well, you can't do what you want to do. And believe me, there's a lot of businesses in our country that face this kind of over-regulation, and we should be very cautious not to put that type of burden on this new entrepreneurial effort in space.
I agree with you. On the other hand, safety is one of the things that we do have to be very much aware of, and that we do have to get the right information and have people who understand what's going on work with those who are regulated.
Maybe we could put them in the same office so they don't have to walk across town or something. Or
could happen.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, thank you.
I now recognize Mr. Swikert for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Educate me a little bit. How many countries right now are launch capable or part of the international treaty, the compact?
There are a number of countries who are involved in space in some way, but today only China and Russia are able to launch people in orbit.
But how many are part of some of the treaty mechanisms out there?
Over 100.
Okay, out of those 100, how many of them have a liability mitigation mechanic? Do they all take it as a government indemnification? Are there others that have bifurcated it or created a reinsurance mechanic? How do other countries also deal with this?
Most of the other countries that we looked at, and we looked most specifically at China, Russia, France, those are some of the main countries, and they all have a government indemnification program.
Is there anyone that you know of, sorry, Doctor, anyone out there who's actually broken that model of sort of a national insurance?
Not that I am aware of, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But it certainly isn't among the largest companies that have the most launches that we have tracked.
Okay. To my other doctors, and this is easy, doctor.
There are 28 countries that have signed or ratified the Outer Space Treaty. There are about 11 countries with launch capabilities. Most other countries, other than the ones mentioned, are launching their own government satellites. So we're not really talking about the commercial end of it, and they have obligated themselves through the treaties to indemnify. Point out, though, that the definition of a launching state extends to countries that purchase a launch.
Well, you beat me actually. My next question is there a bifurcation? I'm a private concern out of Taiwan. I approach the French. They're going to be my lift vehicle to put up a satellite. Do I carry a proportionality of risk? How is that mitigated?
Potentially, but the French...
are you only use French as just... But
no, and I'm using it as an example. They would require insurance of some sort or indemnification for the launch. And
how is that being acquired? So you're telling me if I'm buying lift capacity, that as that purchaser, as I'm out there in the market buying?
Be included in the price of the launch.
Okay, but ultimately I'm paying the French government for that?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Just as a philosophical sort of touch, Congressman Warbacher was actually coming close to something, and let's see if I can sort of express from a personal view, and you tell me where I'm right or wrong. I look at the Internet. One of the most amazing sort of economic curves we can get our heads around. How it's changed the world, changed our lives, changed everything we're discussing and how we do our businesses. It's also something that had a very, very soft touch of government regulation, government intrusion, government control, government definitions. Why does that model not work in this world?
In general, I think it does work, and you need to look at the particular application. So when you're talking computers, then privacy and information scams and so forth are a concern, and the government has a role there.
But you also see what a great job the government does in managing that and stopping it. I mean, at some point, we have to deal with the reality of incentives and smart people committing bad acts.
Good point. And I'm all for industry designing, developing, operating space vehicles. I think the government does have an important role to ensure public safety and, to the extent appropriate, to encourage, facilitate, and enable the industry to be successful.
But if I was going to maximize public safety, does that safety really come from a command and control regulatory environment, or does it come by actually sort of an indemnification insurance environment where the insurance world is actually able to think outside the box, think of other types of mitigation. My best example is, we regulate against securities fraud. We have entire SEC. We have all sorts of robustness out there, but somehow bad things keep happening. But we do go in and bayonet the wounded after it's all over. So my fear is a command and control regulatory environment often is at the back end of the disaster instead of the front end. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I'm over my time. I yield back. Thank you.
I now recognize Mr. Bryanstein from Oklahoma for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of questions, Dr. Nield. When you talk about permitting, under a permit, that's when you do your testing, right? And then when you get licensed, that's when you do your operational flights?
Yes, although a permit is voluntary, you can go right to a license if you'd like.
Okay, but you mentioned that under a license you can still do testing?
Absolutely correct.
So how is that different than permitting?
Congress established permitting somewhat similar to the way we have experimental airworthiness certificates in aviation before or instead of having a formal certification process for the aircraft itself. So under commercial space, if you want to do commercial ops, you need to have a license. If you just want to do some testing or training, you can operate under a permit, and it's a little bit easier, a little bit more streamlined.
So even if you have the license, you can still modify your aircraft for the betterment of the crew and the safety of the crew and everything else?
Absolutely, and we would hope that would continue.
Okay. And then as far as we were talking about the learning period, the chairman asked a question about extending it up to 8 years after the first space flight participant flight. Now, 8 years, do you agree that we need to have the learning period extend beyond where we currently are in 2015 and extend it to 8 years after the first space flight, or I guess the first participant space flight?
Thank you for that question, and I have to say, no, I do not agree with that, and let me tell you why. The U.S. has over 50 years of experience in human spaceflight. Alan Shepard had his suborbital flight back in 1961. The X-15 was making rocket-powered suborbital flights back in 1962. The Space Shuttle, 135 flights over 30 years. Now, it's true that none of those carried a spaceflight participant who actually bought a ticket, but as far as I'm concerned, the design and the operation of those vehicles really were independent of who was riding on board. Now, we had lots of lessons learned, data, problems solved, challenges overcome during that 50 years, and for us to just put that aside and say, well, let's start over without taking advantage of what we've learned, I think is irresponsible.
So, okay, so having that 8-year period originally would have been incorrect then, right?
That would be my position, yes.
Okay, so we shouldn't have had the 8 years, in your opinion, we shouldn't have had the 8 years to begin with, let alone 8 years going forward.
That's correct. However, I'm very sensitive to the concerns that industry has about government being overreaching and burdensome and holding things back. That is not what we want to do in the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. We want to enable safe and successful commercial operations.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, we're going to go into a second round of questioning. There's no objections. All right, I'll yield myself 5 minutes. And according to the experts in the insurance industry, there is a large pool of capital available for launch and payload insurance, but this pool is also used for various other types of specialty insurance and is susceptible to quickly changing world events. Does GAO believe there is a sufficient amount of capital in the insurance market to allow for insurance at a reasonable cost within indemnification? Dr. Cackley?
When we did our work in 2012, we spoke to a number of insurance companies and insurance brokers. We looked very carefully at the question of industry capacity to cover more than the maximum probable loss that is currently required, that launch companies are currently required. And we very much discovered that there is more capacity than what is currently required. And the insurance companies told us that they had the capacity to go as high as $500 million in coverage. But they did talk about the fact that that ability was very much dependent on future events. So as soon as if there were to be a large impact event, that could change very quickly, and therefore there isn't necessarily a stability of provision of insurance going forward that the launch companies could necessarily count on. So we don't have a position as to whether there is and will always be greater capacity, but there certainly is a possibility for greater capacity than what insurance companies are currently providing.
Okay, my final question, this is going to be for Dr. Nield. CSLA envisioned a single license to launch for commercial spaceflight companies, essentially a one-stop shop. It seems that FAA is having difficulty with how to regulate hybrid space vehicles, which are part aircraft and part spacecraft. As I understand it, these vehicles are required to operate under different sets of regulations at different times of operation. This type of process is inefficient and inexpensive. Additionally, anytime there are two sets of rules, gaps and conflicts can develop which can impact safety. How could the Office of Commercial Space Transportation and the Aviation Safety Office cooperate so that the Aviation Office provides all necessary input and expertise on airplane technology, but the Commercial Space Office has the one-stop shop role for the industry?
Thank you for that question. Let me just say that the Office of Commercial Space Transportation and the Office of Aviation Safety do cooperate and do provide support to one another as appropriate. In terms of specific legislation, we certainly support a flexible regulatory structure which promotes growth, safely integrates operations into the national airspace system, and leverages all the capabilities of the FAA. And we welcome the opportunity to provide additional technical assistance to the committee as you consider avenues to correct the perceived obstacles to a streamlined operation.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize Ms. Bonamici for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing the second round of questions, especially since the members over here had to leave before they got to ask questions. So for all of the distinguished panel, think back to the airline industry. The FAA previously had dual roles as both advocate and regulator of the airline industry, and that was eventually split, and the FAA only retained the regulatory role. But in contrast, now the FAA has both roles regarding commercial space. So the Office of Space Commercialization and the Department of Commerce seems to complicate the issue, as that office also has responsibilities that include industry advocacy. So what are the pros and cons of removing the advocacy role out of the FAA, and if that decision is made, what entity or entities would be or could be given that responsibility effectively? Dr. Nield, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I would point out that from the first passage of the Commercial Space Launch Act 30 years ago, there's been this dual role. On the one hand, promote safety, and on the other, encourage, facilitate, and promote the industry. And that sounds to a lot of people like it could be a conflict, and that question has come up over the years. Congress has asked for reports. We've done independent studies. We've had debates about that. But as I look back, I think it has worked very well. To me, the encourage, facilitate, and promote role is a way of thinking. It's not a compromise of safety in any way. And if you look at the record, there have been 254 licensed or permitted launches in those last 30 years, and none of them have ever had a fatality, serious injuries, or significant property damage. So I think we have the balance about right.
Dr. Cackley or Dr. Hertzfeld, do you have the same opinion?
Well, we haven't looked at the duplication across FAA and the Department of Commerce in particular, so I don't have an opinion specifically on them, but I do know that GAO has looked at duplication across the federal government in a lot of different areas, and it is something that we identify as a concern, and it's something that should always be reviewed and considered as to whether there is something that could be done differently.
Thank you. Dr. Hertzfeld?
Yeah, I just, certainly industry has not complained at this point, and I agree it has worked fine up to now. I think there are a couple of issues that require monitoring in this area. When the agency was established in the commercial space launch regulation, we had one type of launch vehicle, ELVs. And then there was, at a point which could come back at some day in the future, reusable and launch and reentry vehicles that can come, land, and take off again. We don't have that now. But if we begin to have a series of different technologies, a series of different types of vehicles, all regulated by one agency, then there could be an issue of some regulations favoring one type over another, all of them well-meaning, but not coordinated in a way that and it could affect companies in terms of promoting space.
Thank you. And I'm going to try to get one more quick question in, Dr. Hertzfeld. With the likelihood of more frequent commercial launches, I wanted to ask about your position on whether developing incentives for private industry to develop insurance pools rather than as an alternative to government indemnification. So in your view, are there some examples of incentives that could have the potential for encouraging those insurance pools? Are they a possible alternative to indemnification, especially in light of the need for newer launch vehicles to pay higher premiums until they establish reliability?
I think the major test would be the growth of the industry. If there are enough launches, then there's possibly enough business to warrant that. This same in a slightly different way, but the same scheme of indemnification was applied with the civil nuclear area, and eventually they were able, when they built enough nuclear power plants, to have their own pool and cover their own insurance. I think it's a ways off, but it's possible.
Thank you very much, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now recognize Mr. Breinstein for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Nield, your title, Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation of the Federal Aviation Administration. And, it was my understanding that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the FAA's Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, COMSTAC, has recommended that the learning period be restored to a full 8 years from the first licensed flight of a spaceflight participant. So what is your relationship with the advisory committee, and do you and the advisory committee differ in that opinion?
The ComStack provides advice to the administrator and to me about issues of interest to commercial space transportation, and we very much appreciate their advice. We are not looking for a rubber stamp or a validation of what we're trying to do. In this particular case, there is a difference that you pointed out between their recommendation and my recommendation to the Congress.
That's all I had, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for you, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. The witnesses are excused, and this hearing is adjourned.
That's a great panel.
That was good.